Welcome to Redditors. Please hit the like button. Let's get on with the video.
Babysitters of Reddit, was there a time you had to call the police on the parents of a child you babysatted? So what happened? I didn't call the police, but I came very close. There was a little boy that I babysat for as a teenager, every Friday of every other week, as no one could handle him. His grandma once showed up at a restaurant and gave him back to his parents when she watched him. He was always pretty good for me, mainly because I would let him marathon Bob the Builder. Anyway, one night I'm making him macaroni and cheese and he's playing in the living room. His parents had been gone a couple hours and it had just gotten dark out. I had put the water on the stovetop and Andy was narrating his game for me from the living room when suddenly a door in the kitchen opened and a man I had never seen before walked out of the basement and into the kitchen. He was dirty, scraggly hair, and freaky skinny. I immediately screamed and threw the not yet hot water at him. He started screaming and yelled that he was and his uncle and he lived in the basement. He stormed back into the basement and I called the boy's parents, who told me that the man was in fact the dad's brother, who had just been released from prison and was living in the basement. They hadn't felt comfortable leaving him alone with their 3-year-old as he had been convicted of violent crimes, so they thought it would be better if I, a skinny 15-year-old girl, was there as an intermediary. I called my dad, who came and spent the next 5 hours with me until they got home. I'm not sure the conversation they had while I was waiting in the car, but I didn't babysit for them again for a long time. I called family services, if that counts. I started babysitting for a newly single mother. She had just moved into an apartment with her 3 kids, so things were understandably, at the time anyway, a total mess. Bare mattresses on the floor, clothes in piles, no food in the cupboards. The only furniture was a couch and her bed. At first I was sympathetic. I only watched her kids for her to work as a server in the evenings and she expressed how hard she was trying to get her life together. But nothing changed at all as the weeks went by. Then she started coming in way later than when I knew the restaurant was closed, visibly messed up on drugs and alcohol. The last time I watched her daughters, she stumbled in the wee hours of the morning vomiting, completely out of her head, showing off a fresh tattoo, while earlier that same evening I had genuinely struggled to find enough food to satisfy all 3 kids. I was so sad and overwhelmed. She was paying me so well, but I realized even at 17 years old that was called hush money. I couldn't hush. I ran into the kids in a grocery a few years later with their dad and grandma, where they told me they had been living since they saw me last. They gave me hugs and looked so happy and healthy. No one but my mom ever knew about my involvement. Yes, she had baby formula next to her meth pipe on the counter. I was young and couldn't get the baby to stop crying, so I called her and she sent some random girl over. The random girl revealed that there was a toddler asleep in the back that I didn't know about. I told my mom and she called CPS and the cops. Turns out the woman had like 2 or 3 more kids that she wasn't allowed to see. When I was young, my babysitter had to call the police twice. Once because my mom, who had limited visits with us 3 kids, came banging on her door to get us and take us who knows where. Babysitter hid us in a closet and called the cops. Second time was when we were playing hide and seek in the apartment courtyard and my brother took hide and seek a little too seriously. He refused to come out from his hiding spot and then some person said they saw him leaving with a strange man. Finally, after the cops showed up, he came out from under some bushes, proud that not even the cops could find him. I had the police while babysitting. Parents got into an accident and fled the scene. Police caught up to them in their driveway. The cops came to the door and told me to keep the kids in the back of the house so they wouldn't have to see the lights or the parents getting arrested. I agreed to stay until the grandparents got to the house. My parents had CPS called on them when I was a baby because I had really bad diaper rash that bled a bit, and the way my diaper absorbed the blood made it look like way more than there actually was, so she thought I was being abused. CPS had a doctor examine me and determined that I wasn't being abused, and that was all. My mom told me about it in my 20s. Not the cops but an ambulance. My husband's cousin had just moved in an apartment down the road from me. She had 2 kids, both daycare age. One morning she called me and asked if I could watch little baby boy. She then proceeded to tell me the older one would be going to daycare but baby had a bit of a cold and daycare wouldn't allow him there. I said sure. 10 minutes later she showed up with him. He was sleeping at the time. She told me he had just eaten and would sleep for a bit. I was fine with that. She left immediately after, no meds, no directions. I had a 1.5-year-old, so I had supplies. I felt his head and he was hot. I took his temp and it was high, way higher than it should be, so I called her work before cell phones, and I got her on the phone, proceeded to tell her this baby is sick, very sick, he needs to go to the air room. She refused. I called our grandmother and told her what was going on and called her dad. The whole time this baby hasn't moved, and I am starting to panic. My uncle told me to call the hospital and call an ambulance. Uncle called mom and finally got her to acknowledge how sick he was. He was in intensive care for almost a month and almost died. Because of the lack of oxygen, he has learning disabilities and pretty much will never be on his own. His mother blamed vaccines. Because of the situation, CPS then had to do a wellness check on my home. I will never forgive her for what she did to that baby and how he could have died in my care. Years ago I babysat 2 kids, 10 and 7. The 10-year-old was threatening us and threw his little sister out of the house. I followed and he locked us both out. Wisconsin winter, no shoes. It was near home. So I brought the girl to my place, but couldn't leave a crazy kid alone. So I returned and he let me stay with him until parents returned. This was before cell phones. I was paid $1 an hour, tops, no apology, no sugary sodas, no maraschino cherries in the door of the fridge. Parents were wealthy. A couple years later the boy set fire to himself. I regret not doing more, but honestly, I'll never understand why his parents didn't do more. I didn't exactly call the police myself, but I was once babysitting for a single mum who had a 3-stroke 4-years-old. She was at a strange stage of life but was essentially house sharing a council estate type house with a single dad. They weren't involved together, just housemates. He had 2 kids as well, 6 and 8 approximately. This guy was around while I babysat because I guess they had an agreement that they didn't look after each other's kids. He was nice and offered me food, although I'm pretty sure he was a bit of an alcoholic. At about 10 PM the mum of the 2 kids turned up, off her head drunk or high, and just starts to scream and shout at the dad. She's ranting and raving about something or other and hitting him, acting like an actual maniac. She was completely crazy. I just grabbed the 2 kids that I wasn't babysitting and took them into the room with the girl I am babysitting to shelter. The mum keeps at it for a while until the dad eventually manages to shut her in a room and calls the police. They came and dealt with it. I gave a statement and that was that. It was really sad because the 2 little kids acted as if it was no big deal and they were used to it. I was pretty horrified. I didn't go back. No, but their neighbors called the police on me. I used to babysit triplets just down the road from a grocery store and the parents asked me to pick some stuff you owe for them. They paid me a little extra for running the errand. Well, one of the neighbors called the police and accused me of kidnapping the kids. One family I used to babysit for decided to give me money to take their toddler to McDonald's instead of feeding him at the house. Besides the fact that I had to walk him halfway across town. Our town was just big enough that everyone I saw that day didn't know me, so they all thought I was a teen mom and I got so many judgmental looks. I've been babysitting since I was 12, worked in daycare and I'm currently a nanny. I have called the police on a family I babysat twice. I've also filed a couple of CPS reports, but in my experience those didn't go anywhere. First time I called the police was because the child's mother didn't come home. She was supposed to be home by 1 AM but just never came back. Parents are late a lot, so it wasn't that big of a deal until the sun started rising. Grandma picked up the baby and the cops found mommy passed out drunk by some bar. She did not hire me again. Second time was because when I was changing a diaper it was clear the toddler had been assaulted. I'm not going to say how, but it was obvious. I almost think her dad wanted me to see because he was still there when I called the police and it was just so obvious. It was a total show. Unfortunately the child's mother got custody even though she definitely enabled the behavior. Dad was arrested at least. Don't know if this counts, but I used to work at a summer camp when I was a teenager. About once a week we would all walk down the street to the community outdoor pool. There were 2 girls, 5 and 8, who were very shy and stuck to themselves a lot. We only had them for about 3 days at this point. I tried to include them in games, but it was like they didn't see anyone around them and just lived in their own bubbles. One day when we were getting ready to go to the pool, I was helping some of the younger kids put sunscreen on their backs. I remember asking the younger girl if I could help her and she nodded. When I lifted up the back of her shirt to get her shoulders, she was absolutely covered in bruises and what I guess were cigarette burns. Every inch of her back. It was the most horrifying thing I'd seen at that point in my life. I was 16 myself, so I went to my boss and showed her the girl's back. Her older sister was exactly the same. We ended up calling the police and they came and got the girls that afternoon. Never saw those girls again. Oh, one time my sister was babysitting for our French teacher and her ex-husband stormed in and passed out drunk on the couch and she had to call the police because he was not supposed to be there. The summer I was 17. I was recommended to babysit for this family with 2 young boys, 7/8 and 11/12. I showed up for my second day like I did the day before and the mom left to go to work. The younger boy was arguing with the older boy because he wanted to play on his iPhone. The older one was telling him that he couldn't play. I thought we were alone in the house. All of a sudden an angry large man walks down the stairs and starts yelling, "Hunter, give me your phone or I'm going to whoop you." I did not know that the dad was home. He came down without acknowledging me and whacked the younger boy so hard, I froze. I was scared he was going to hit me. He just had that angry look in his eyes. The dad never once introduced himself to me and no one ever told me that the dad would be home. I almost called CPS once. I ended up telling the boy's friend's mom to watch out for them and explained what happened. She said that she has never met the dad. He never comes to the kids' soccer or baseball games. I was babysitting a 5-year-old. I let him download an app and said if your parents say to take it off you have to listen. I went to the bathroom when the parents came home. Once I got out of the bathroom I saw his dad punch him in the stomach about 13 times yelling, "I told you not to download apps." I called the cops. They came. I didn't babysit that family again. Not quite what was asked, but one time a small tornado hit next to our house while the babysitter was at our house. I got a frantic call from the babysitter where she kept repeating, "Your tree is in the driveway." It must have been pretty scary as the tree barely missed the house. We headed home immediately but it took forever because trees were down all over the neighborhood and all the traffic lights were out. We tipped generously. The toddler was completely unfazed and having a great time playing with flashlights. Reverse story here. When I was around 8 I called the police while being babysat. What was the reason for that, you may ask? Simply because I wanted to see what happens when you call the police. I immediately hung up when the dispatcher answered and no more than 10 minutes later a policeman showed up at our house. Our poor babysitter must have been scared to death, but she handled it well. I did get a lecture after that to only call the police if there's an emergency.